Hey guys, what's up? MadSeason here, back with another episode of Time Warp for you. This is a series where I talk about things that have been removed from the game for one reason or another. And in this one, I wanted to talk about the evolution of raiding in World of Warcraft. The main course for any MMO is raiding. Large-scale groups of people working together to take down tough bosses and get loot as a reward. And in the World of Warcraft, it's changed quite a bit ever since its release 13 years ago. So, in this video, we'll talk about the size of the raids, why they were different, the different difficulties, some of the raids themselves, and I'll sprinkle in some of my own personal experiences where appropriate. But hopefully keep the video more about the raids. Just have fun reminiscing like we always do, and maybe give people who didn't get a chance to play back then a little insight on how much things have changed. I'll be doing this mainly from memory. I'll be fact-checking, but if I get anything wrong, give me a little slack. It's been 13 years after all. And feel free to post any corrections, of course, if you have any. And since this subject is quite huge, I think the best way to do it is maybe split it up into multiple parts. In this episode, we'll cover vanilla raiding, and we'll go over the other expansions in future episodes. So, this way we're thorough, but the video also isn't an hour long. Okay, so rewind to November 2004. A new game called the World of Warcraft is lighting the world of MMOs on fire. You take a couple of months to journey from level 1 to level 60, do some 5-man dungeons with friends, and once you're ready, raiding. There were actually 4 raids at the release of World of Warcraft, at least that I know of. We of course have the well-known ones such as Onyxia's Lair and Molten, but we also had the Blackrock Spire and Scholomance. These were initially raids at release. In the case of Scholomance, the dungeon initially was very tough and pretty much required 10 people. It was only after a patch that the mobs were weakened and the size was capped to 5 people. And in the case of the Blackrock Spire, this was a 15-man raid and was unofficially split up by the players into UBRS and LBRS, short for Upper and Lower Blackrock Spire. To go to Upper, you went left, and to go to Lower, you went right. You could go through either side with 15 people, but it was only really required for the Upper. Lower was far easier and was runnable by 5 people. And in patch 1.1, similar to Scholomance, the raid was nerfed and the player limit was lowered, this time to 10. So, the first raiding experience for a lot of guilds wasn't Onyxia's Lair or the Molten Core like many people believe. It was actually the Blackrock Spire and pre-nerf Scholomance. In terms of loot though, those first 2 were the places to be. These raids were 40-man, which was interesting in itself. 40 people is quite a huge number, and it had a lot of subtle effects on the raiding scene that you might not think about. Just offhandedly here, one is the room size for all of the boss fights. Every room was massive because he had to give 40 people enough room to spread out. Comparing the caverns of the Molten Core or the giant rooms of AQ40 to some of the rooms in Nighthold or Antorus, they were much, much bigger. And another side effect was dead weight. With 40 people, you had a lot more wiggle room than you do today, and you could have people who didn't really know what's going on. You know, people who think that fire has some healing properties. This was appropriate though because at the time, everyone was new of course. For the lack of a better term, we all kind of sucked compared to now with our years of experience and seeing similar mechanics repeated. These days, we can say that, oh, this fight has a tank swap, or we have to spread out for this one, whereas back then, it was new, and it took some trial and error to figure out why everyone was dying. World of Warcraft was a lot of people's first MMO, so a lot of stuff you think that is self-explanatory really wasn't back then. And combine that with the fact that sites like YouTube weren't a thing yet, or they were in their infancy, you didn't have immediate access to full 720p video walkthroughs going over every single mechanic. So, because of all of this, the fights were really tuned for around 30 people playing really well, rather than 40, and you could have maybe those extra 10 as dead weight basically. Now, this was only really true for these first 2 raids. Things of course started getting more complicated with the Blackwing Lair, AQ40, and Naxxramas, and All 40 people had to be on top of their game to stand a chance to clear them. Another thing the 40-player limit complicated was loot. Each boss only gave you a few pieces of loot, so it was tough splitting that between 40 people. There wasn't personal loot back then. Some guilds just went with the roll for the main spec method, which was chaotic, and others went for the free-for-all / roll command method, which was even more chaotic because things like this would happen.
Yeah, I want that ring. I do.
Alright. Who else wants it other than rogues? Because all the rogues can't roll on it. Kron, what are you doing?
What the fuck? Oh my god! What the fuck?
And other guilds who wanted to have some sort of order went with the DKP system, which stands for Dragon Killing Points. This was adopted from the EverQuest MMO, and basically it's a system that gave you points for participating in raids, maybe supplying the guild with raid consumables or whatnot. Then you bid against your fellow raid members for items, and whoever has the most points wins. Each item has a cost tied to it, and that cost is deducted from the winner's point total. This was the preferred method for most guilds because it was impartial, not based on luck, and it awarded those who supported the guild the most by showing up to the most raids and helping other members out. As far as I know, this has now been phased out with the introduction of personal loot, but it's an interesting system to look back to. Definitely a headache for guild masters though, because they would have to screenshot who's in the raid, who gets what item, how much that item costs, and put it all in a spreadsheet and sort out discrepancies or mistakes, and after all of that, put it up on their guild website so people can actually keep track of their points. So, this 40-man size had a lot of different effects on the raiding scene that you probably wouldn't think about, and honestly, I'm probably forgetting some. By all means, if you have any, share them in the comments. But another side effect of this larger size is the composition of the raids. Today, as far as I know, fights require just 2 tanks, maybe 3 or 4 healers, and the rest DPS. Of course changing depending on how many people you have. But during vanilla specifically, you could have fights that required several highly geared tanks, dedicated healers for each of those tanks, raid healers, and then the rest as DPS. Tanks have always been in short order, so this would put a lot of stress on guilds to keep a healthy roster of them. And as a result, you would have guilds recruiting tanks from other guilds, which would of course cause a lot of drama. Something to keep in mind is that we couldn't freely switch specs back then, so you were a tank or you weren't, plain and simple. And to top all of it off, for the most part in vanilla, the only tanks were warriors, which made it even harder. As far as I can remember, we didn't have feral tanks or paladin tanks back then really. So, a lot of the difficulty at times wasn't about the fights, but just getting the right people together so you have the right composition. The balance was all over the place. Rogues by far were the best DPS, warriors the best tanks as I said, priests the best healers, and everyone else had these little niche roles that they would fill. Warlocks, while they weren't very good at damage, were able to banish elementals and demons, so you'd want them in the raid just for that, along with summons and soulstones. Druids for the most part were relegated to healing. They weren't as good as priests, but they had the Innervate spell and battle reses, which made them useful still. Like I said, the balance was all over the place, and you would have specs that were flat out useless in the raiding scene, such as the Balanced Druid, the Fire Mage in the Molten Core due to its resistances, Shadow Priests I believe weren't too good because they had mana issues, and so on. It's one of the side effects, not really due to the size of the raid, but just with the game being new in general and the developers still getting into their stride. Balance overall was vastly improved in the Burning Crusade expansion, but that's a subject for the next video. So, that's a bit about some of the background stuff. Let's talk about the actual raids for a bit. I won't go too in-depth here story-wise because I'd rather keep this video more about the gameplay and mechanics of raiding. But, as mentioned before, our first 2 big 40-man raids were the Onyxia's Lair and the Molten Core. Onyxia's lair was our single boss dragon raid, holding Onyxia herself. To zone in, as we went over in a previous episode, there was a very extensive attuning process requiring several quests, elite bosses, and escorts. It was pretty long and tough, but at the end, you got an item called the Drakefire Amulet, which allowed you to zone in. All 40 players had to go through this attunement process, so even zoning in was quite the challenge. But, to be honest, it was fun for me. I'm a big fan of having endgame stuff to do other than just gearing, so I'm actually quite fond of the attuning in a lot of ways. Although I think it can go a bit overboard sometimes, as we'll discuss in part 2. So, with 39 friends and fellow raiders at your side, you charged the broodmother of the Black Dragonflight, and for most people, this was their first taste of a fight that actually had phases. Up until this point, the majority of dungeon bosses were basically tank and spank. You had some outliers, but for the most part, you tank the boss, heal the tank, and hit it very hard. So, you can just imagine the awe and panic when Onyxia took to the sky and started incinerating everyone from above. With enough guts though, you brought her back down to the ground and finished her off. Your first raid boss killed in your first 40-man raid. And the world first was on the 30th of January of 2005 by the guild Ruined on the Proudmoore US server. It was quite the moment for a lot of people. It came easy to some guilds and harder to others, and it was the birth of the Onyxia wipe animation, which is one of the more famous or infamous moments in the game's history.
Whelps! Left side! Even side! Many whelps! Now handle it!
And now that she's dead, the only thing left is to split up her loot between 40 people. And what's this? She drops purples? That's another thing I should mention here. At this point, the highest quality gear that most people had were blue items. Some dungeon bosses dropped the odd purple here and there, but they were very, very rare to see. Nowadays, you can get a full set of purples in one day, but back then, they were pretty tough to get. And as you would imagine, there was no shortage of drama over them, even if your guild was using the orderly DKP system. Like I said, everyone wanted them, even if they weren't good. Remember, this was early vanilla raiding, back before we knew anything about eye levels, stat weights, and so on. As long as they were purple, they must be good, we thought. But then of course we eventually smartened up and started looking at the eye levels and stats and such. It's an interesting setup that we've lost over the years. Now, having a full set of purple is common, and now it's just about the eye level and quality of that purple is what matters. Even legendaries are something that you're guaranteed to eventually get, and because of that, your class is balanced around them. Anyways, back on subject here. The next raid was the Molten Core, which was our first real 40-man raid of the game. This raid didn't have just one boss, but 10 bosses, ending with the mighty Ragnaros. This was the main event for raiding at the time. Several different challenges to overcome, and it set the tone for how big the standard raid should be for the game. A little fun fact for you is that it almost didn't even make it to the game. Blizzard was running out of time, and they actually threw it together in 1 week before the release. The game designer, Jeff Kaplan, did the creature placement, Scott Mercer did the boss fights, Alex Afrasiabi made the attunement quest, and Bob Fitch did all of the loot. Speaking of which, another fun fact is that it actually dropped both Tier 1 and Tier 2 sets. Tier 2 was later moved to the Blackwing Lair raid, which was added later. It was a mess, but it worked, and it was a great start for the raiding scene in World of Warcraft. As I said, Ragnaros was the final boss, killed by the guild Ascent on the US Medivh server on the 25th of April of 2005. Wait a second, US guilds getting world firsts? Now that's something we haven't seen in a while, huh? The fight against Ragnaros required some resist gear, which was also a big thing in vanilla raiding. Basically, to sum it up, some bosses required certain resistances or they were just impossible. Ragnaros needed fire, Huhuran and AQ40 needed nature, Saffron and Exramus needed frost, and so on. Gear that had these resistances were pretty hard to track down, and you had to have it specially crafted for you, or run some random dungeon for a certain piece. These resistance fights, along with the resistance stats, are no longer in the game, but they were a big part of raiding back then. And going back to the Molten Core for a second, this raid was also the source of the first legendaries in the game. We have the Talisman of the Binding Shard, which was only looted once before it was patched out, the Thunder Fury Sword, and the Hand of Ragnaros Mace. If epics were still a big deal back then, you can only imagine how big these legendaries were. They were tied behind epic quest chains or special objectives, and were quite legendary to say the least. If you're curious, I have dedicated videos for both of these weapons in the description if you'd like a more detailed look at them. And after the Molten Core came the Blackwing Lair, Zul'Gurub, AQ40 and AQ20, and lastly Naxxramas. I don't want to go over all of these one by one because it's not the point of the video. I just wanted to talk more about how the actual raiding worked and the feeling behind it rather than the actual raids. But in general, they got better and more refined. The Ahn'Qiraj and Naxxramas raids had special events tied to them which were amazing experiences themselves, as anyone who played back then would tell you. Zul'Gurub and the Ruins of Ahn'Qiraj were just 20-man, which sort of paved the way for smaller skill raiding in the game, which would be adopted in the Burning Crusade expansion. Ahn'Qiraj and Naxxramas were the hardest challenges, of course. The now game director of World of Warcraft, Ian Hazzikostas, actually proved that the Cthulhu boss in AQ40 was impossible to beat, assuming that you had the best gear and perfect play from all 40 raiders. You just weren't able to put out enough damage to keep up with the spawns, and it was only after a nerf that guilds started taking him down. So, if that isn't tough, I don't know what is. And another important thing to note is that there were no difficulty settings back then. If you couldn't do a raid, you couldn't do it. There was no normal, heroic, mythic, or LFR modes. Naxxramas, of course, was also very challenging, not just in difficulty, but also in keeping people interested in raiding it. Not long after its release, the Burning Crusade expansion was announced, which really killed motivation for a lot of guilds, including mine. It was common knowledge that the level cap would increase, and that any gear that you would get in there would be replaced. And combine that with the extreme challenge and the lack of progress, attendance slowly died off, and most guilds called it quits until the next adventure in the Outland. In fact, guilds saw so little of the raid that it would eventually be re-released in Blizzard's second expansion, The Wrath of the Lich King. So, 40-man raiding, DKP, epics being epic, the dawn of raiding in World of Warcraft. This is our first step in a pretty big subject. In the next episodes, we'll talk about the Burning Crusade, how the raids were scaled down to 25, and also Wrath and the introduction of different difficulty modes and so on. I hope you found the video interesting or entertaining. Like it if you liked it, and I'll see you in the next episode of Time Warp. Peace.
Farewell for now, mortals. We hope you enjoyed today's video. See you again soon.